Well, new revelations out of Jeffrey Epstein's apparently not so little black book. New names appearing, names that we maybe knew about but didn't know the details of, billionaires in that little black book. In addition to which, we've got new revelations from the Associated Press, which are doubling down and they want you to believe that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. New revelations from the Associated Press, which we will get to that and so much more. And our guest today is Whitney Webb, investigative journalist, whom I trust no one better to dive into these details. Whitney, great to see you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So let's, I guess, I want to start with the Associated Press piece that came out, and we can kind of go through these documents. And they start off, the very first sentence in the Associated Press piece says, Jeffrey Epstein took his own life. I mean, right at the start, they're setting the tone for how this piece is going to unfold. So what do we learn from the Associated Press about the mysterious circumstances of Epstein's death?
Right. So it seems to me that, despite the fact that you have people, very mainstream, Alan Dershowitz, Julie Brown, for example, even refusing to embrace the official narrative of Epstein's death, that he committed suicide without help. For example, those people maintain that he had some sort of assistance in killing himself. It's hard to take that seriously. And I say that also because, if you remember back, there were a lot of things that happened at the prison the day he died. So, for example, cameras weren't working, specifically the camera pointing at his cell. You had claims and also a lawsuit, I believe, brought against the prison guards for forging records and negligence. And within these documents are those records that were these guards were charged, over allegedly forging. And then those charges were quietly dropped several months later. And now the AP is sort of releasing those and I guess other documents that are trying to paint this picture that there's no conspiracy when it comes to the death of Jeffrey Epstein. And, I'm a little bit skeptical, obviously, because of what I just mentioned, specifically the Bureau of Prisons situation, how the prison guards were targeted and then suspiciously not targeted, and also allegations that not long before Epstein died, William Barr himself visited that prison, which was reported, I believe, in the New York Post. All of this is sort of left out of the Associated Press's narrative. Now, it's a lot of documents. I haven't had a chance to go through them all. But again, what I sort of see here is basically the Associated Press's attempt to approach Epstein's death, not unlike the Warren Commission attempted to approach the JFK assassination, sort of provide a narrative, provide some sort of documentation, but omitting, major points that would call that evidence into question, like the fact that some of these records were allegedly forged, for example. Mm-hmm. Providing us with forged documents, how does that help?
Do they even make mention? I didn't see it, like the camera footage, that the cameras were turned off. It seems like very clear omissions from their report.
Well, this is why I say that it seems some sort of effort, I guess, from the powers that be to try and restore trust in the justice system when really it's at an all-time low, not just because of the Epstein scandal, but because of all the other things that the FBI has been involved in recently, from refusing to release this document from the whistleblower about Biden engaging in pay-to-play politics and all other sorts of things going on there. So, how did they, I guess they're trying to tackle the Epstein thing and be like, well, actually, this is what happened and Epstein is responsible for his own death and there was no funny business on our part or on the part of the Bureau of Prisons. And essentially trying to quell what they see as a very viral and very widely embraced conspiracy theory that someone like Epstein, who had, by his own admission, lots of dirt on powerful people, would have just taken his own life as he was, allegedly agreeing to cooperate with investigators while he was facing a significant prison sentence. So,
yeah. And some of these,
again, I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I think, as am I. And in these Associated Press piece, they really try to paint him as having sort of a mental breakdown. But then they kind of bounce back and say, but he had a great life and that he has no reason to want to be depressed. So they do point out and they try to talk about how he had his head in his hands over the weeks ahead of time, that he was upset. He was trying to drown out the sounds of a nonstop running toilet in a room. It seems like there was a lot of psychological attention on his mental fitness.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that way. But again, I feel like, I'm sure he was probably under duress in prison because, of course, when he was in prison the first time, it was a very different situation for him because he was allowed to leave, for example, to go work. And things like that, and definitely was not in the type of prison situation he was in the second time. But again, there's widespread skepticism, and I think this is, even before the AP stuff, and this is an attempt to quell that and potentially redirect that, because I think we're having sort of an unprecedented attempt to misdirect when it comes to the narrative about who Epstein was and what happened in relation to the scandal. Because, as I've noted in my work and other people as well, the more you pull on the thread of Epstein, the more corruption you inevitably expose. And so mainstream media has really made a consistent effort to try and limit the permissible narratives when it comes to Epstein, and what crimes of his are okay to talk about, which ones are not, and what is okay to talk about in relation to his death and what is not. So, again, I treat a lot of this with skepticism. I think they spent a lot of time trying to craft a particular narrative they thought would be convincing, again, because so many people don't really believe the official narrative. And again, there's a lot of other things, including logistical stuff about Epstein being taken on and off suicide watch and why those decisions were made, and some of the questions about the logistical ability for the official story of Epstein's death to be true, among other things. And, for example, his cellmate had a smuggled in cell phone at one point. I mean, there was a lot of weird things going on around this period of time. And also we have to keep in mind that at the time he died, there was unprecedented media attention on his case from the public. So he was arrested in July and then, died in August. And so that's like over a month of where he's the biggest story really in the English speaking world and possibly beyond. And obviously a lot of the powerful people to which he was connected probably did not want that to continue. And I think we've seen consistently that there's been hope that with Epstein being dead, a lot of the interest in the story would also die. I think that's why you see people like Bill Gates, when they're continually pressured about their ties with Jeffrey Epstein, when confronted, they say things like, well, he's dead. That was Bill Gates' response not so long ago. And so I think the hope is if we can sort of take any of the conspiracy tinge off of that death and, hopefully wrap up the story and memory hole it. I think that's sort of, the goal here, and to try and sort of mute public interest and be like, well, there may be a more reasonable explanation for this stuff that looks really suspicious. But again, if you're having mainstream media journalists on this case, like Julie Brown, consistently not believe it. Well, she believes he committed suicide, but with help, right? And so, that doesn't really fit with the official narrative either. So it's important to keep in mind that there's sort of this spectrum outside of the official narrative, which is he committed suicide without help in the prison because he was afraid of facing justice and a lengthy prison sentence, and didn't kill himself for any other sort of reason. Again, at the same time, I also think this is an effort to focus so much on Epstein's death specifically at the expense of focusing on his connections, the network he participated in, what he accomplished for that network that goes beyond a lot of the activities that are normally talked about, and how a lot of people in that same network continue to be active. Right.
Well, that's what I want to talk about now, which is, these other names that he's had contact with, the revelations. Daily Mail has obtained a trove of Jeffrey Epstein's private calendars, the same, I think, that we saw from the Wall Street Journal.
The same as the Wall Street Journal. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the emails, et cetera, that shows that Epstein had connections, obviously, with presidents and prime ministers. But among the names that I wanted to focus on, billionaire Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel's name showing up there, multiple meetings planned with Jeffrey Epstein on those calendars. What do you make of the Peter Thiel connection? Seems like there's a lot here that we haven't talked about.
There is a lot there. And again, I was disappointed in the Daily Mail for leaving a lot out, of course. So Peter Thiel was meeting with Epstein per these documents at a time when he was had a major leadership role both at Palantir and was on the board of Facebook, which is essentially a company he helped put on the map, being one of the earliest investors in Facebook. And he was connected to Facebook, as I can go back to and circle back in a second, by a guy that was recruited by the CIA when he was a teenager. Sean Parker is the person that brought Peter Thiel on to Facebook. But Peter Thiel was also part of Founders Fund at the time, or was more active, I guess, then than he was now. And one thing that was left out, for example, of the Daily Mail report is that Founders Fund, along with Epstein, Ehud Barak, and Leslie Wexner, poured a significant amount of money into this intelligence-linked startup called Carbine 911 that even still today has essentially become the provider of emergency services, meaning like 911 call centers throughout the United States, and has a very disturbing pre-crime element and a way of basically mass mining data off of your phone without your consent if you ever call 911 in an area where the center is managed by this particular company, which was founded by Israeli intelligence veterans, formerly chaired by Ehud Barak, who we've talked about before, was very close with Epstein, and not just a former prime minister of Israel, but a former defense minister and a former head of military intelligence of Israel at the time that military intelligence of Israel was working very closely with Robert Maxwell and allegedly recruited Epstein into the fold. Ehud Barak potentially having had a very personal role there. So to circle back why this is relevant as it relates to Peter Thiel and sort of paint the bigger picture here, Peter Thiel created a company called Palantir. It's pretty much a provable CIA front company. If the first 3 years of its existence as a company, it only worked for the CIA. Its programmers went to Langley every 2 weeks to have them guide the development of the code and all of that. And one of the top guys that Palantir worked with at the CIA was a man named Alan Wade, who at one point was the CIA's chief information officer. And prior to that, Alan Wade co-founded a company called Gilead with Christine Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's sister. And Christine Maxwell, was involved with Israeli espionage efforts related to the Promise software scandal with her father in the 1980s that specifically involved selling bug software to U.S. nuclear laboratories in the United States. The front company was called Information on Demand and was actually the subject of a major FBI counterintelligence investigation that was shut down from the higher-ups at the very top of the FBI at some point. So you have Alan Wade helping to guide Palantir, and actually Gilead and Palantir do very similar things in terms of turning troves and troves of data into actionable intelligence. So that's an odd connection. And then the other thing, too, is that essentially what happened with the creation of Palantir was a deliberate effort by Peter Thiel and Alex Karp to recreate a very controversial surveillance program that was pitched after 9/11 called Total Information Awareness, that was going to be run out of this DARPA office by a former Iran-Contra conspirator, John Poindexter, considered to be the godfather of modern surveillance. And Thiel and Karp approached Poindexter with the help of Richard Pearl, one of the architects of the Iraq War and a prominent neocon in the Bush administration, basically asking Poindexter how they could recreate TIA, the Total Information Awareness Program, which was, as it sounds, a warrantless mass surveillance program. But it wasn't just aimed at analyzing what people are doing in real time. It also was focused on essentially pre-crime. And Palantir, after its involvement with the CIA and people like Alan Wade, has since then been very involved in predictive policing, as they call it, piloting that, I believe, as early as 2015, 2014 in different localities in the United States. And Palantir is also today a contractor to, I think, all 18 U.S. intelligence agencies. And one of the labels they can apply to people, including domestically, is subversive. And there's a lot of stuff going back to what I mentioned earlier with the Promise software over an effort to maintain a list of domestic dissidents in the United States. Palantir because of the continuity with Promise, Gilead, and that, and of course TIA and some of these other programs, there's cause for concern there. So Peter Thiel is meeting with Epstein while he's involved with these different programs, and his venture capital fund puts money in this Ehud Barak driven, intelligence company that's marketing its services to, American emergency services nationally. And that particular program has a component that they call C Records, where they keep a record of every 911 call, an emergency, an event ever. And they use that to predictively analyze where crime will happen before it strikes, essentially. Wow. So it's another part of this pre-crime puzzle. And I really would wish that more people would pay attention to that, because as we see this effort to ramp up this war on domestic terrorism, I think a lot more people should be paying attention to these types of connections, for sure.
What kind of fruit does it then bear? Meaning they do this pre-crime analysis. Does it mean that there's more police popping up in a particular area, more surveillance? What does this then turn into when they have this pre-crime information, the Thiel network of American surveillance?
So it depends. So, for example, what I mentioned earlier, at TIA and sort of its predecessor in Iran-Contra, there was this database called MainCore that still exists today of domestic dissidents. And MainCore was created during Iran-Contra because the goal was to round up Americans that could potentially be deemed national security threats in the event of a vaguely defined national emergency. And this group, a national emergency could be something like mass nonviolent protest to U.S. military intervention abroad. Things of
like
that nature.
An anti-war protest.
Yes, massive anti-war protest. And this was filed under what they called the Continuity of Government Protocol. But I think for our purposes, we can essentially call Continuity of the Deep State Protocol. Any sort of major challenge to that particular entity's power, this could be activated ostensibly. And the last person to report on it, I think in mainstream media, was Chris Ketchum and Tim Shorrock in 2008. And at that point of time, it had 6 million Americans on it. It was seen being actively used in the White House after 9/11 by the Bush administration, I think specifically in Dick Cheney's office. So this is a database that's still around today, and Palantir is essential to running it, basically. And what it has today is all of the NSA, everything the NSA and affiliated agencies have sucked up on people through their surveillance, warrantless surveillance programs, including your financial records and your text messages and your posts on social media, is all in this MainCore database. But in order to analyze that and decide who might be a problem, that's what Palantir essentially does for the national security state. So someone being affiliated, with Epstein there is very disturbing. And then the other side of this is Facebook. So as I mentioned earlier, Peter Thiel was one of the early Facebook investors, having been connected to Facebook by Sean Parker, who's tied up with the CIA. And the same day Facebook launched is the same day that a DARPA program that was also sort of involved with this surveillance program I mentioned, Total Information Awareness, was shut down, that was called LifeLog. And essentially LifeLog is analogous to what Facebook has become, which is interesting in and of itself. But of course, you have at the same time that Thiel is meeting, roughly around the same time that Thiel is meeting per these documents with Epstein, he's also going to events where Peter Thiel is present with Mark Zuckerberg, for example. So Zuckerberg's also meeting with Epstein. And it may be unconnected, but I'm sure you're aware that the Wall Street Journal just recently reported that the Facebook-owned Instagram was providing this vast network of pedophiles' ability to operate with apparent impunity. So I don't really know what to make of that, but it's certainly disturbing, to say the least.
Yeah, we covered it last night on the show, and I couldn't help but thinking about this Epstein connection and the fact that Zuckerberg and all of this is tied together with these billionaire elite class, and what this means for sex trafficking revelations. I don't know, we can pull all of this together. I'd like to figure out. And you know, Mel Gibson is releasing this 4-part documentary on sex trafficking around the world, what this means for these networks and maybe exposing some of these these elite networks. I hope, one can only hope, that we might see some revelations in that. What do you think?
Yeah. But, well, essentially, in the context of what we've talked about today, I think a way to make it easier for people to understand in the context of the Epstein scandal is that in the age of warrantless mass surveillance, the type of sex blackmail in which Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell engaged for many years is now irrelevant, because they can just harvest all of that from your devices, or even if you don't engage in that activity, they can plant it on your devices and frame you, right? So there's plenty of ways to get people to be compliant to the powers that be, the deep state, without having any sort of in-person sexual blackmail activity take place. And I think ultimately that's why someone like Epstein became expendable by the time it rolled around to 2019, because, you know, such technology has become ubiquitous and people's entire lives are digital. And you have these companies like Palantir sucking all of that data up and using it to analyze people. MainCore, actually, according to people that had intimate knowledge of it, was used to blackmail politicians, for example. So it's very possible that, you know, some of this NSA warrantless surveillance has served a similar purpose. And I think we would be naive to think that people in Congress today haven't been blackmailed by other means than Epstein per se. So essentially, the nature of blackmail, as the intelligence agencies have used it historically, has undergone a massive change with the advent of technology. And I think that's why you see people like Epstein and Maxwell pivoting so intensely towards Silicon Valley, specifically after Epstein's first arrest, and getting involved with these companies that have mass access and mass control over people's data, because you can blackmail people with their data now. Right.
Instead of luring them to your island where there just happen to be underage girls. Yeah, it's much easier to just plant the stuff on someone's device.
And cheaper.
Right. Wow. Yep. Unbelievable. I hadn't thought of that part of it, but you're absolutely right. Whitney Webb, thank you so much, as always, for this. We'll continue to watch this. I'd love to have you back on as we get more details about, I would really love to figure out what's going to be unfolding in these Mel Gibson documentaries and how this is connected to this broader elite sex trafficking ring as well, and what sort of connections that has. I know that's something you've been passionate in covering as well. So thank you so much for joining us today for this piece of the story, and we'll have you back real soon. As always, great to see you.
Thanks. Likewise. Take care.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.